My head pounded, a dull ache behind my eyes. I tried to move, but my limbs were heavy, the air cold and damp. I forced my eyes open. The world was blurry, then sharpened. I was on a cold, hard floor, blood pooling beneath me. Panic surged. I scrambled back, hitting a wall, glass. I was trapped in a transparent box, my own reflection staring back. Beyond the glass darkness, endless and impenetrable. I banged on the glass. No echo, no response. Utter silence. I looked up. Above me, a mirrored ceiling reflected my battered form. Then in the darkness beyond, a shadow flickered. I wasn't alone. I was being watched, and terror sharpened inside me. Suddenly, blinding white light crashed down, erasing the darkness. I shielded my eyes, exposed and vulnerable. Then a deafening roar. Applause, wild and manic from everywhere and nowhere. My eyes adjusted. Beyond the glass, silhouettes filled tiered seats, a vast, faceless audience, their gaze pressed in, suffocating. I was their spectacle. The applause faded to a tense hush. They waited, hungry for the next act. The spotlight was on me, and the show had only begun. The silence after the applause was suffocating. I pressed against the glass, desperate for escape, but the box was seamless. My mind raced. How did I get here? A shortcut home, a sudden pain, then nothing until this nightmare. Cameras glided through the darkness. Red lights blinking, recording every moment. This wasn't just a show, it was a broadcast. My suffering streamed to unseen viewers everywhere. I was no longer a person, just content for their consumption. The crowd's anticipation was palpable. The real performance was about to begin. A figure emerged from the shadows, impeccably dressed, moving with eerie grace. His face, a white porcelain mask, fixed in a serene, empty smile, black eyes hollow and cold. He approached the glass, placing a bare hand against it, almost tender, but chilling. He leaned in, the mask inches from mine, silence stretching between us. Then, a whisper, "Welcome, you are the star of our show tonight. The main attraction." The crowd murmured approval, hungry for what was to come. "Our patrons are connoisseurs of endurance, the poetry of pain," he said. The audience was ready. The host straightened, voice smooth as silk. "A tradition, a riddle, solve it, earn peace, fail, and you help us create art," he whispered. "I have no voice, but I tell stories, no body, but I travel the world. I can be broken with a word. What am I?" Panic clouded my mind. "Silence," I stammered. He chuckled, cold and humorless. "Close, but the answer is a promise." The crowd stirred, anticipation thick. The host produced a scalpel, a slot opening at the base of the glass. He reached through, seized my arm, and drew the blade down my forearm, a line of red blooming. Pain exploded, sharp and electric. Applause thundered from the darkness. The pain was a bright fire, burning along my forearm. My blood welled up, tracing the blade's path. It dripped onto the floor. The applause swelled, validation for my suffering. They were cheering for my pain. The host retracted his hand. He regarded his work with the detached air of an artist. My prison felt smaller. Time lost meaning, replaced by the throbbing wound. My reality was defined by pain and watching eyes. Then the lights flashed. A bell marked the end of a round. The applause roared back louder. It was time for the next act. The host moved to the front of my cage. This was the rhythm of my new existence. As the host prepared for his next violation, a new light flickered in the darkness. It wasn't the main overhead light. It came from the side, a soft, ethereal glow. I tore my eyes away from the needle and looked toward the source. Another box had lit up, identical to mine, a perfect glass cube, suspended in the void about 50 feet away. Inside, I could see a figure, a woman. Her face was pale, streaked with tears and dirt. She was huddled in a corner, her body trembling uncontrollably. The sight of her sent a fresh jolt of horror through me. I wasn't the only one. This wasn't a solo performance, it was a gallery. Then another light blinked on, and another, and another. All around me, glass boxes materialized out of the darkness, each one illuminated from within. They were arranged in a vast circle, a horrifying carousel of human misery. In each box, a prisoner, a man with a broken leg, the bone jutting out at an unnatural angle, a young woman, her face burned and blistered, an old man weeping silently as blood dripped from his fingertips. We were a collection, a museum of pain, each of us displayed in our own little vitrine for the amusement of the faceless crowd. We couldn't hear each other, couldn't touch, couldn't offer a single word of comfort. We were utterly alone together. My host paused, the needle held aloft. He seemed to be letting me take it all in, allowing the full scope of the horror to settle upon me. He wanted me to see my peers, to understand that my suffering was not unique, that I was just one part of a much larger, more monstrous production. The other victims were in various states of awareness. Some, like me, stared out in shock, their eyes wide with dawning comprehension. Others were curled in on themselves, lost in their own private worlds of agony. A few beat their fists against the glass, their silent screams lost in the vast, quiet space between our prisons. It was a silent symphony of despair. I looked from one box to the next, my heart breaking for each of them. Their pain was my pain. Their fear was my fear. We were all lab rats, all part of the same sick experiment. I saw one man, his face a mask of defiance, stare directly at his own host, a figure identical to mine, complete with a smiling porcelain mask. He spat at the glass. In response, his host calmly produced a small, elegant blowtorch. The crowd murmured with anticipation. The message was clear. There were many stages, many performers, but the show was always the same. Resistance would be met with more elaborate, more spectacular forms of pain. Each of us was a channel on their television of torment. The host ignited the blowtorch. A brilliant blue flame roared to life. The man in the other box flinched back, his terror evident. His host knelt and thrust the flame through the slot. The man screamed silently. The audience loved it, applauding the torment. My gaze snapped back to my own host, kneeling with a needle. The smiling mask seemed to gauge my reaction. The floor felt slick with my blood and sweat. The floors of all the cages were stained, some heavily, showing how long some souls had been here. The woman nearest me began to beg, offering anything for mercy. Her host simply watched, letting her break down completely. The cruelty was in the psychological torture. One by one, the hosts began their coordinated performance, a symphony of pain. The variety was sickening. The victims reacted in different ways. Some screamed, some wept, some went rigid. There was no escape through unconsciousness. The show had to go on, and now it was my turn again. My host finally moved. The spectacle in the other cages had served its purpose. I was now fully aware of the rules, the stakes, and the absolute lack of hope. He brought his smiling mask close to the glass again. The needle in his hand caught the light. He didn't need to threaten me. The entire room was a threat. "Round two," his voice whispered. "I am always hungry. I must always be fed. The finger I lick will soon turn red. What am I?" The answer was immediate, obvious, and utterly terrifying. Fire. What was the point? Wrong or right, the outcome felt the same. "Fire," I said, my voice low and hoarse. "Correct," he whispered, "but the answer does not prevent the art. It merely changes the medium." He produced a simple wooden match and a small corked vial of clear liquid. There was only the next wave of pain. The host's words hung in the air. My hope was extinguished, replaced by rage. The game was a fraud. My cooperation meant nothing. My defiance meant nothing. All paths led to my suffering. He was going to set me on fire. The thought cleared my mind. To survive, to fight back. I had nothing. My foot slipped in my own blood. And in that moment, an idea sparked, a desperate, insane plan, but it was better than kneeling. It was a choice, my choice. That was his mistake. He did not expect the rat in the cage to lunge. A small flame sputtered to life, and in that instant I moved. I threw myself backwards, slamming my head against the glass. Dazed, I slid down, blood trickling down my neck. I hadn't done it to break the glass, but for what came next. The host paused, match aloft, head tilted with detached curiosity. I stomped into the pool of blood and shattered vial, a shard of glass. My hand closed around it, a weapon. I staggered up, the shard an extension of my rage. The host looked at the shard, then his reflection, only amusement. He blew out the match. The game had changed. I stood, blood dripping, shard held out like a knife, no longer unarmed. "Come and get your art." The smile stared back. The applause was different this time. It wasn't just for my pain, but for the drama. I was no longer just a victim, I was a contender. The host acknowledged the crowd, never taking his eyes off me. He was the maestro, and I was his rogue instrument. He seemed to relish it. Holding the glass shard, I began to test my prison. I scraped the shard against the surface. It left no mark, not even a scratch. The glass was impossibly hard. My only audience was my own reflection, a bloody, desperate man trapped in an unbreakable cage. I spun around, panting, and faced the host again. He hadn't moved. He just stood there, watching my futile efforts. The host let the silence stretch, giving my failure time to sink in. My chest heaved, my body trembling with exhaustion. He was the absolute master of this domain, but freedom is not found by breaking the walls of your cage. It is found by understanding the nature of the cage itself, which brings us to our next riddle. I have no locks and I have no doors, yet you can be a prisoner within my floors. The rich man wants me, the poor man has me, and if you eat me, you will die. What am I? It was a perfect description of my transparent hell, nothing, and my prison was ultimately a prison of nothingness. I just shook my head. I refused to play anymore. My silence was defiance. Refusing to participate in his twisted game felt like the only power I had left. The host stood motionless, the smiling mask a blank slate. He seemed to be considering my insubordination. This was an unscripted moment. I had broken the pattern and the outcome was uncertain. Then that soft, dry chuckle echoed from behind the mask. And you, my friend, have just volunteered for a more improvisational piece. My little rebellion had failed. He was giving me an opening. He was inviting me to act. Another layer of his psychological game. He wanted me to make the first move. He wanted my violence to be the trigger for his own. It was a masterful piece of manipulation. He was trying to write me as the villain of my own tragedy, to act or not to act. Both paths led to pain, but one felt like my own. I chose to act. I chose my own path to pain. With a raw-throated roar that was more animal than human, I lunged forward. I didn't aim for the hand. I aimed for the mask. I dropped to my knees and thrust my arm through the narrow slot, the jagged glass shard leading the way. My world narrowed to that single point of impact. It was a desperate, suicidal gamble. I expected his hand to shoot out, to grab my wrist and twist, to break my arm. I expected pain. What I didn't expect was to connect. The shard, my pathetic weapon, scraped against the hard porcelain of his mask. It was a glancing blow, but it was a blow nonetheless. The sound was a high-pitched screech of glass on ceramic. For a split second, I saw a white scratch appear on the serene, smiling cheek of the mask, a flaw in the perfection. The host recoiled, not with the speed of a predator, but with the shocked surprise of someone who had never been touched. He fell back, one hand flying to his face. It was a human reaction. A moment of genuine, unscripted shock that broke through his cold, theatrical persona. A thrill, sharp and electric, shot through me. I had hurt him, I had marked him, I had made the untouchable host bleed, in a manner of speaking. It was a victory, however small, however fleeting, but the victory was short-lived. My arm was still extended through the slot, exposed and vulnerable. Before I could pull it back, his other hand shot out, not to my wrist, but to my hand itself. His grip was like a vice, his gloved fingers crushing mine. He squeezed, and a bolt of pure agony shot up my arm. I heard a sickening crunch. The glass shard, my only weapon, shattered in my fist, the fragments grinding into my flesh and bone. I screamed, a real scream this time, torn from the very depths of my being. The pain was blinding, all-consuming. It erased the small triumph of a moment before, replacing it with a universe of hurt. He twisted my hand, his strength monstrous. He dragged me forward, my face smashing against the inside of the glass. The audience roared. This was what they wanted, not the cold, clinical pain of the scalpel, but this raw, desperate, ugly violence. The host held my broken hand for a moment longer, ensuring the lesson was learned, then shoved it back through the slot. I collapsed onto the floor of my cage, cradling my mangled hand, my body convulsing with pain and shock. The host rose slowly to his feet, his hand still touching the scratch on his mask. The smiling face was unchanged, but I could feel the shift in the air. The performance was over. This was personal now. Section 3. The Locked Doors. The host stood over me, a silent, menacing statue. He slowly lowered his hand from his mask, his gaze from the empty eye holes burning into me. The scratch was a tiny flaw, but it felt like a canyon, a symbol of my defiance. The audience's roar faded into a hungry, expectant hush. The dynamic had shifted. This was no longer just the torturer and the victim. It was a grudge match, me versus him. And the crowd was desperate to see how he would retaliate. He turned his back on me for the first time, facing the darkness where the audience sat. He raised a hand, and the lights in the arena changed. The bright, clinical white light of my cage dimmed, plunging me into a twilight state. Simultaneously, the lights came up on the rest of the arena, not fully, but enough to see. The shadowy silhouettes of the audience sharpened into focus. They were all wearing masks. Not the host's porcelain smile, but simple, elegant black masquerade masks that hid their identities. They sat in opulent velvet chairs, holding glasses of champagne. And around the entire circular arena, I saw them. Doors, dozens of heavy steel doors, exits. For a wild, insane moment, hope surged through me. If I could just get out of this box, maybe I could get to one of those doors. As if reading my thoughts, the host made another gesture. Above each steel door, a light switched on. They were all red, locked. He was showing me with theatrical cruelty the true nature of my prison. The cage wasn't just this glass box. The cage was the entire arena. The audience, my captors, held the keys. They were not passive observers. They were active participants in my confinement. My escape was not a matter of breaking through a wall, but of convincing 1,000 silent, masked sadists to let me go. And as I looked at their still, expectant forms, I knew that would never happen. They had paid for a show, and the show would not end until they were satisfied. The host turned back to face me. He began to unbutton his suit jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. The violence was about to spiral, to escalate beyond the measured cuts and burns of the earlier rounds. He had been playing a role, the elegant master of ceremonies, but I had scratched the mask. I had broken the script and revealed the monster beneath. Now the monster was coming out to play. He took off his jacket, folded it neatly, and placed it on the marble floor. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing pale, sinewy forearms. The porcelain smile remained, but the pretense of a game was gone. This was no longer art. It was punishment. Section 1. The final performance. The final lights blazed to life, a searing blood-red glare that painted everything in hellish tones. My breath came in ragged, burning gasps. My body was a roadmap of agony. The host stood before me, just outside the glass, his porcelain mask a grotesque parody of joy in the red light. It was my only victory in a war I was destined to lose. He had stepped inside my prison, joining me on the small, blood-soaked stage. The violence that followed was a raw, brutal, personal war we had fought, my desperation against his cold, methodical rage. Now it was over. The world was beginning to blur at the edges, the red light softening into a dark, welcoming fog, but the house always wins. My gaze drifted over the audience. They were the true monsters, the ones who fed this machine, the faceless, nameless evil that consumed lives for sport. The final lights burned bright, and I knew the curtain was about to fall. A single soft clap echoed in the crimson silence. Soon the sound was building, growing into a thunderous, roaring ovation. A standing ovation, for the blood, for the broken bodies, for the absolute destruction of a human spirit. They were cheering for the host's victory and for my demise, applauding the final brushstroke on a masterpiece of pain. The sound crashed over me, a final weight on my soul. My body finally surrendered. I collapsed forward. My vision was shrinking to a single point of darkness. The roar of the crowd was the last thing I heard. I was never meant to win, never meant to escape. I was just the entertainment. My only purpose was to bleed beautifully for the amusement of those who watch from the dark. The applause continued, a relentless, eternal rhythm.